Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm very excited. Last summer, we started this project, Learning with My Rabbis, and this is now season 2 of that series. I'm very excited to share some of the teachers with you that have helped impact me and my own thinking and my own approach to the rabbinate. And you'll see some of them and their ideas as it comes through me and the Torah and the preaching that I do and the teaching that I do here at Beth Tikva. Today, I'm very excited. Our first guest of this season is someone very, very special. Rabbi Ed Feinstein is the senior rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he later received a doctorate there in education. He was one of my teachers at the Ziegler Rabbinical School, where he taught us essentially how to give a sermon, although we had a much fancier word for it. Homiletics, I think, was the title of the course, but how to talk. So any complaints you have about my sermoning, you can bring it up with Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein, thank you so much for joining us.
It's wonderful to be with you, Rabbi Sachs. Really wonderful to share a few minutes with you.
I wanted to start out with just a little bit of background about you to just have everyone get to know you a little bit better. What is it that made you want to be a rabbi? How did you end up becoming who you are today?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, Rabbi. And for all the members of your community, I'm really delighted. Rabbi Sachs was one of the most extraordinary students I taught at Ziegler. I've been teaching at Ziegler for 30 years now. And I was really very honored to donate him to the Canadian Jewish community and offer you the promise of a wonderfully creative, articulate, deep rabbi. And it's really been a wonderful joy to watch him develop in this role. First of all, it's a wonderful joy to see him with a beard, because he didn't have it when he was my student. I saw that he became engaged and then became married, and I understand that now he and his wife are expecting their first child. And I just wish you all of our blessings, the congregation, for taking care and nurturing and protecting my dear student, and for Louis and your wife for many, many years of simcha and joy in the community. Thank you. Thanks for having me. My route to the rabbinate was rather circuitous. My parents were Zionist socialist kibbutzniks. My parents are American-born, children of immigrants. They made Aliyah in 1950, built a kibbutz in Israel, part of Hashomer Tzair, which is an anti-religious kibbutz movement. My father was the baker on the kibbutz. My mother was a shepherd, which she never gave up on. And they loved kibbutz life. They lived kibbutz life. But there was a big split in the movement in the 1950s, split in the ideology of the movement. My parents found themselves on the American side of the split, which was the wrong side. And they ended up coming back to America. And the joke in my family was that my mother didn't want to come back. So my father said, "I'll give you a child." And I was conceived on the boat and on the way home. My parents, we moved to Southern California when I was very small, my brothers and my parents and I. And my parents owned a little kosher bakery here in Canoga Park, in a far suburb of Los Angeles. And my mother ran it as a community center. My mother ran the front of the shop. My dad ran the back. It was full of people of every background, of every culture, but everyone felt that they belonged. And that's where I saw how the power of community. And I worked there every weekend of my growing up. My parents made a Shabbos table. Even though they worked insane hours, bakers are like that. My dad would come home early on Friday and he'd rest and he'd shave and shower and get ready. And my mother would come home and cook a big kibbutz Friday night dinner served in big plastic bowls. And then we'd make kiddush and motzi, light candles, give blessings. And then my father would ask a question. And the table was a place of conversation. It was a place where ideas mattered. It's a place where morals mattered. We talked about civil rights for Black Americans. We talked about Israel and its place in the world. We talked about the Jewish people and their future. We talked about feminism. There was a war going on at the time, the Vietnam War, and the United States government sent me an invitation to participate. And the question was, should a Jew who has enjoyed the liberty of America participate in a war that I had serious problems with? And that was discussed at our table. Friends would come, family would come, big table full of people. Of course, it was a baker's family, so there was always 100 kinds of cake and cookies on the table. But those conversations firmed up my idea of what Jewish life could be. And I've always sought to recreate that kind of conversation in the venues that I've served as a Jew. So it's been a great honor to be a rabbi in the community. I went to rabbinical school because I wanted to learn what rabbis knew, and I've always tried to create in my opportunities in the community those kinds of conversations around tables. So that's how I got to be a rabbi.
Right. Well, you've been a rabbi now. I believe you were ordained 1981, if that's correct. So
Yeah, in the last century. So it's BCE. So it's a long, long time. Yes.
it's been a couple of years, more than me, that you've been working. So I'm curious, how has the rabbinate changed from when you first entered it back in the early 80s till today?
Well, it's very simple. I can give it to you in a simple syllogism. Um, we moved to Southern California, to the neighborhood I grew up in the suburbs, in 1961. Big suburban house that my parents bought for $22,500. My mother, the day we moved, my mother put us in the back of the station wagon, my brothers and me, and she made 3 stops that day. She dropped us at the local public school. She looked for the supermarket to buy food for dinner that night, and then she went go looking for a shul. My mother was part of that generation that belonged as a reflex. Jews need to belong. There's no other way to live except to belong. Generation now, my generation, the generation that follows me, my kids and their kids, belonging isn't necessary in that way. It's not a reflex, it's a choice. And the question is, how do we make the case to belong to a shul, to belong to a community, to belong to the Jewish world? How do we understand ourselves as part of a Jewish people worldwide? These things don't come naturally the way they used to. Now they have to be taught. Now we have to persuade people. And that's a whole different language. It's frankly a different language that I was taught when I was in rabbinical school. The language of law, of Jewish law, that language doesn't resonate with people. What they're looking for is meaning. How do I find meaning in my existence? How do I find a sense of purpose as I go through my day? How do I find the resilience to get through the tragedies and trials and challenges of life? Where do I find community to share my life with? These are the things that we talk now. It's a very different spiritual language than I was trained in, and a different spiritual language that used to exist. And I'm very loyal to the tradition. That's how I was trained and where I was raised. And those are the books that I spend my life in. But I have to be very cognizant of the fact that the next generation that I'm speaking to speaks this different language. And that's the biggest difference that I see.
So I think it's actually a great segue. I was going to bring it up in a little bit, but you've written a few different books, and one of them, the most recent to come out, is In Pursuit of Godliness, and it's about the life and the rabbinate of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who was your predecessor at Valley Beth Shalom and who you got to learn from closely and work closely with. And I know for him, he was one of the major voices of the last century that helped kind of shape American Judaism and what a synagogue could look like as a part of a center for community. One of the things I've always loved at Valley Beth Shalom is the mental health center that you guys run, as just a wonderful way to be in there for people, and what's really an important part of life that usually people don't think of as something that's Jewish or that's part of the synagogue. So I'm curious, and we can talk a little more in a bit about Rabbi Schulweis, but what are some of those ways that you've helped to envision Valley Beth Shalom and your community as kind of a gathering place, a place for things that connects with modern Jewry?
Well, see, I had an amazing gift in my life. I found great teachers. It's a prayer that I make every night when I go to bed. I thank God for the people that I found. And I had wonderful teachers as I trained to become a rabbi. Neil Gilman, Elliot Dorff, wonderful, wonderful people. And then as I've grown into the field, I found wonderful people as well. And the most spectacular of all of them was Harold Schulweis. Harold Schulweis came to Valley Beth Shalom in 1970. I was 16 years old. And believe it or not, I don't make this up, my wife and I, the woman who's now my wife and been my wife for 42 years, we were on our first date that night. I had worked at Camp Ramah all summer, made $75. took the entire $75 and invested it in one date with the one girl I was madly in love with, took her to the most beautiful restaurant in Southern California, took her to the most beautiful concert at the Hollywood Bowl. And afterwards, I put my arm around her and said, what would you like to do now? And she said, let's go to shul. And I said, frankly, that wasn't what I had in mind, but it was slichot. It was the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah. And it was Rabbi Schulweiss's first sermon at VBS. And we went together. And there were 1,500 people in the sanctuary. We sat in the back with all the teenagers. And I'd like to say I fell in love twice that night. I fell in love with the rabbi who would be my rabbi and the woman who would be my wife and partner. Schulweiss was a remarkable soul. First of all, he believed in the synagogue. He believed that anything was possible in a synagogue. And he preached that and taught that. And he believed that it's our responsibility to bring God into the world. Schulweiss never worshiped upward. He never worshiped a God who lives up in the sky. He worshiped outward. He always said he added 2 words to every prayer: by me. So when you pray, Osa Shalom Bimromav, may the one who makes peace in the world bring peace into the world, by me, through me. Motzi lechem min haaretz, we bless the one who feeds the world, through me. Borei rofei cholim, blessed is the one who brings healing, through me. And the purpose of synagogue was to engage those energies that human beings have to bring godliness. That was his word, godliness. A certain way of living morally above the fray of the world, to bring that to bear into all of the things that we do in a shul. And that's what I learned from him, and that's what I've endeavored to continue to develop in my congregation. I don't think it's about programs. I mean, a lot of programs. We do a lot of classes. We do a lot of initiatives. The real essence to it is relationships. How do I build relationships among my congregants and with my congregants? I remember I learned this as a young kid, watching Rabbi Schulweiss as a youngster. The first week I was a rabbi. I was a day school director in Dallas, Texas. I'm walking through the hallway, and I just told the kids a really wonderful story. And there was a little kid, a 4-year-old, and he'd been finger painting. And he saw me, and he was so excited to see me. And he ran toward me to give me a hug. And the thought that crossed my mind was, I'm going to either sacrifice my pants or sacrifice my relationship to this kid. And I chose the kid. And the kid hugged me with his finger-painted fingers. And those pants were ruined. My wife got so angry because those pants were ruined forever. But the kid knew that this rabbi would hug you. I'll give you one more story, Louis.
Please.
I told you this in class. So my first week as a rabbi, my wife sent me out to the supermarket to get some milk. And I'm walking through the aisle, with a gallon of milk in each hand. And there's a shopping cart with a mom coming up, and there's a kid in the jump seat. And the kid was one of my kids, one of the kids in school. And he looked at me and he said, look, Mom, it's God. And he's right. Because the people who teach us God, that's the personality that religion and faith and synagogue and tradition have for us for the rest of our lives. If we're lucky enough to have warm, loving people, that's what Judaism is for us. But if we're sad enough to have distant rabbis, forbidden rabbis, I mean, a lot of rabbis who were so wise and so smart and so learned, but they never let you get close. They'll never let you hug you, even with finger-painted fingers. But I decided I wanted to be a God who hugs. I wanted to be a God who's present. And that's the kind of synagogue I've endeavored to build for the last 30 years. I wanted to be a place when you walk in the door, people say, how are you? It's good to see you, Louis. How can we help you? How can we give you a life that matters? And that's the kind of shul that I endeavor to run. It's hard. It's a big institution. We have to do finance. So I have a budget and finance committee like everybody else. I have to take care of broken air conditioning and dirty floors and kids who yell at their parents and parents who yell at their kids. I got all the challenges that everybody has, but I've endeavored always to personify the God, to embody that divinity that is embracing and loving and close and warm and supportive. And that's what I think we need to do in shul.
I love it. And my community, whether they know it or not, are actually probably very familiar with Rabbi Schulweis because so many of my own sermons and teachings have been impacted from his writings, as well as the classes I teach. And we've done theology classes about God and classes on ethics. So much of the different theories we've studied have been from Rabbi Schulweis's writings. One of the things that's always bothered me about Judaism today is that, at least in my own Jewish education growing up, we never really spoke about God. We got the stories about God in the Torah. And then as we got older, we got science in schools. We got evolution, we got the Big Bang Theory. And the Torah kind of got relegated to these stories that had good morals, but God was not something, the God described in the Torah couldn't fit into the life that I had. It was only later on when I started really looking at these questions and reading and researching that I was able to develop kind of my own theology, something that made sense for me in the modern world. And I'm no Rabbi Shuley with predicate theology. His views, I think, really do resonate, but I don't have a good elevator pitch. I'm wondering if you could give us a short, because even after I read it, even after I teach it, I'm not sure I've explained it well. And we've done it in 3 or 4 hour long sessions. So I'm wondering if you could give us what's the God Rabbi Schulweis believed in, and how can we understand that God?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. So I once had that conversation with my rabbi growing up, my congregational rabbi, who was a very, very learned and loving man. I still revere him. But I was a rebellious teenager. I had long hair and crazy ideas. And I went to him once and I said to him, how come you don't talk about God? You know, you talk about everything else. You talk about Jewish education, you talk about Israel, you talk about the Jewish family, you talk about assimilation and intermarriage, and you talk about ethics in the world, but you don't talk about God. How come? And the poor man, his eyes filled with tears. And he said to me, what was I going to say, Eddie? What was I going to say? We have survivors in the shul. We have people who saw what human eyes should never see. The destruction of whole families, of whole communities. It was the generation right after the Shoah. I was born in the 50s. He said, what were we going to say? How could we say anything that wouldn't be so grossly offensive, particularly in the ears of those who had survived Auschwitz and Dachau? And I felt his anguish. Schulweis did too. So what Schulweis did is said, look, what part of the God language of the tradition can I hold to? And he said, look, when I say a bracha, Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam motzi lechem min haaretz, what part matters most? He said, if the purpose of the bracha was to praise God above, then all you need to say is Baruch atah Adonai or Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam, period. Why do you need the next part? What's the next part for? He said, the next part is really what it's about. What's important is not to praise a God who lives above, but to recognize certain activities, certain functions, processes, things we do in the world, verbs, not nouns. Like motzi lechem min haaretz, we feed the world, and to recognize that as of absolute moral value. That's divinity. It's the divinity of what we do, not what divinity does in the world. That's what religion is really about. Religion, it says Schulweis, is there to teach us how to be godly. So I teach this to my kids, and I can teach it simply. I said to the kids, what's a noun? Person, place, or thing. I said, good. Is God a noun? They say, yes, God is a noun. God is a somebody. I said, good. Where does God live? And all the kids go, up in heaven. Good. I say, what's a verb? Well, verb's something we do. And then I say to the kids, and what if the word God is a verb? And they'll all look at me for a minute and they'll start to laugh. Oh, you mean you can be godding? I can do God? I say, yes. What would you have to be doing to be godding in the world? What would you have to be doing? Because after all, what is the whole Bible about? The Bible is about God saying, Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai. I want you to bring Kedusha into the world. I am the source of Kedusha. You bring Kedusha in the world. What does God say to Avram Avinu, to Abraham? Hayeh bracha. You bring the blessing into the world, right? What does Moshe say to his people right before he dies? He says, HaTorah said, this Torah is not, this mitzvah is not too hard for you. It's in your peh and in your lev, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. We are bidden again and again to bring God into the world. Schulweis says, how do you do that? You do all the things that tradition teaches you are godly. That's Schulweiss's predicate theology. It's not about believing in God. It's about behaving God. I'm not interested if you believe in God. That's an interesting fact of your biography, but I'm watching how you behave. I'm watching how you talk to the people you work with. I'm watching how you talk to the bus driver or the gardener or the maid or the janitor in your building. I'm watching how you talk to your spouse and to your children. I'm watching how you spend your money. I'm watching how you spend your free time. I'm watching how you touch the world. That tells me if you live with God and God lives in you. That tells me if you're a godly person. And that religion is ultimately about godliness. Look, the best example of this is the last page of the Moreh. The greatest book of Jewish philosophy ever written is Moses Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Don't try to read it at home. It's too hard. Get Rabbi Sacks to take you through it. You need a guide or you'll get lost and never come home. It's the most complicated, difficult book ever written by Jews. But he's trying in that book to teach us how to get close to God. And the metaphor he uses is Moses ascending the mountain. Moses ascends the mountain, the top of the mountain, and there he stands with God. But there's a philosophical problem that Moses Maimonides could not figure out. When Moses gets to the top of the mountain and he stands panim el panim, face to face with God himself, how come he comes down the mountain? Why doesn't he stay up on it? If the purpose of human life is to find divinity, is to achieve that quality of personality and mind that you finally realize divinity, why on earth would you come down to the world of schedules and bank deposits and garbage cans and war and peace and disease and health? Why would you come back to the world? And Maimonides said, because the ultimate end is not to know God. The ultimate end is to bring the knowledge of God into the world, to do tzedek and mishpat and chesed just like God does. That's predicate theology. It's the last page of the guide. The last page of Maimonides is the first page of Schulweiss. Be God in the world. Be the personification of divinity. That's predicate theology. Now, a lot of people don't like that. I'll tell you why. Because it doesn't speak of metaphysics. It doesn't tell us how the world is created. It doesn't give us a God who can hug us. We want Avinu Shabashamayim, a God who's watching out for us. We want a God who's protecting us. And I resonate with that. I understand that. And Schulweiss says, if that's what you want, you can imagine that. That's fine. But what's more important is to be that character, to be the resonating, to be the protective, supportive, and kind, loving, kind force in the world. The last thing I'll say is, Louis, you've been with me many times. We've been to Shiva Minyans. Family is bereft. A family is broken. Someone they love has died. Most wonderful thing in the world happens. House fills up with people. House fills up with food. House fills up with memories. House fills up with prayer. And all of us together put our arms under the burden of their grief and we lift them up. We do the work of God in bringing them back to life after the death of a loved one. That's what my teacher, Rabbi Schulweiss, taught.
I love that. There's so much there to unpack. I know just hearing you talk about Shiva Minyans, it makes me want to smile and cry at the same time, because there's been so much pain and so much difficulty this last year with COVID, but it's the Shiva families, the people in mourning, that I've really just seen it in some ways the most. And it's been so difficult because those are the people who need a hug, who need a community, who need social gathering more than I need it, and more than other people need it for a birthday or my wedding even. It was sad people couldn't be there, but it's different. It's the people that need the lifting up that you just can't do virtually in the same way.
Right. And I'll tell you just one more, just to fill your eyes with the same tears over the loss and how much we protect each other. There's two guys in my congregation who are world-class medical scientists. They each have their own areas of expertise. One is in working in pediatric infectious disease, and one works with the diseases of the bowel. This last year, they gave up their research projects for an entire year to join the crusade to create the vaccine. Now, both of these guys have degrees and accolades and honors up the wazoo. Both of them have a lab filled with 50, 100, 200 postdocs, all people with PhDs in biochemistry and molecular biology. And they turned both of their laboratories into factories to figure out how to fight this virus. They created this vaccine faster than any virus vaccine, vaccine has ever been created. And the way they did it is by mobilizing all these scientists around the world. There was a network, an online network, that every night these guys would get on and they would chat and they would exchange their findings with all the other guys in the world. It wasn't one guy who invented the vaccine. It was hundreds and hundreds. And the thought that, while we were all suffering, there were these hundreds of people working 16, 18 hours a day looking for the vaccine. And, and I have friends, like I'm sure you do, doctors who worked in hospital. I watched their faces. They'd call me at night because they were so discouraged, and I'd have to lift them up. And the poor guy is wearing 3 levels of protective stuff because he's so afraid of catching it himself. And he's working 16, 18-hour days. And you don't pay people for this. This is the God inside of them fighting for life against death. And you have to, it's an amazing story that'll have to be told one day. And that's the other place where you see divinity in the world. So Schulweis taught us, don't look for burning bushes or sticks that turn into snakes. Look for doctors who fought this disease. Look for nurses who held a hand of a dying patient. Look for scientists who mobilized their resources to find the medicine. Look for rabbis who came to be with people at moments of isolation and loneliness and sadness. Look to those and you'll see the God that you need to see in the world.
No, absolutely. The vaccine really was a miracle, and it was the scientists and the researchers and the doctors and everybody that's been involved in this process and caring for everyone. These were angels. These were real life angels who have been working and doing divine works this year. On that subject, though, both of congregants with degrees out the wazoo, as you put it, as well as Maimonides, the guide for the perplexed, it always struck me, and it was particularly in rabbinicals when we learned about kashrut. There were all sorts of rules about, ben yomo, that this thing goes essentially back to parav after a day, and then it would be kind of afterwards. But we don't want to tell people that. That's for you. That's not what you would tell other people, because if that got out, everyone would just use one set of dishes, kind of a thing. There was a Judaism for the rabbis, and what we were supposed to then go and teach our congregants. And I'm not saying everyone in rabbinical school taught us that way, but I heard that on occasions. And similarly, the guide for the perplexed, Rambam wrote in Arabic because it was for the educated. It was for the kind of elite, the scholarly group, while his Mishnah Torah, which is another incredible work and accomplishment on its own. I hope I get one accomplishment in my lifetime. Rambam had dozens. But the Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew for everybody to understand. But today, when our congregants are doctors and lawyers and teachers, and I have a professor, I have people with PhDs, do you still think that there's that kind of division, or should we be teaching at that same level, having those kinds of theological discussions, having those in-depth ethical conversations, the ideas that it wasn't until rabbinical school that I learned that we could understand things interpretively, that there were sources in the tradition that said maybe the Torah wasn't all written by Moses and handed by God at Mount Sinai. There's other ways of looking at it. But I still, even though I never heard it as a kid growing up, and even now, I don't see a lot of rabbis from the Bima talking about such things. You get the occasional, Passover sermon that makes a Wikipedia entry with Rabbi Wolpe, one of your colleagues in LA. But other than, it's not something I hear regularly. Do you think that those are the kinds of things we should be talking more about? The intellectual, academic, theological side, as opposed to just the basic level stories and rules and understanding?
I've never believed in that division. I think that's terribly destructive. Every one of us, from professors and lawyers and doctors to kids in school, we're asking the same fundamental questions. We're asking, why am I here in the world? What is my existence for? Where do I find a sense of purpose? Where do I find, what experiences give me a sense of the meaningfulness of my existence? How do I live as a moral person in an immoral, corrupt, deceitful world? How do I gather people around me to build a community so that I have those to share my simchas, my joys with, and those I share my pain with? We're all asking the same questions. And we, rabbis, we happen to have some of the answers, or at least we have directions to find answers. We have this remarkable wisdom to share. And the fact that we hoard it for ourselves and give people crumbs is a travesty. It's a shanda, right? We just have to find a language. The problem is that a lot of the sources of the tradition are written in a language which is inaccessible to our friends because they don't speak rabbinic. Some of it's Hebrew, some of it's Aramaic, some of it's Yiddish, some of it's in mystical text, some of it's in philosophical text. They speak medical, they speak legal, they speak mamaloshin, but they don't speak. So our job, and Rabbi Shul always taught me this, our job is to be a translator. And when you can translate from the rabbinic language of our tradition to the internal language of our tradition back into the experiences of life that people are seeking guidance with, you see a light go on. One of the things I love to do, Rabbi, is I love to teach texts that everybody knows. I'll teach a class on prayer, but I won't take some arcane prayer from the Yom Kippur liturgy. I'll teach a Don Olam. There's a secret at the heart of a Don Olam. Did you know what it is? I'll teach the Kiddush. There's a secret at the heart of Kiddush. That is, take something people have been reciting 1,000 million times and show them that they missed the point. That there's something remarkable right there, right in the middle of the tradition that they've been keeping. It's like you ever watch, there's a TV show here in America called Antiques Roadshow, where people bring their tchotchkes to these experts. And every now and again, the guy will say, "Do you know what this is?" And the guy said, "Yeah, it's an old painting that my grandfather had." He said, "No, it's a Rembrandt. It's worth $100 million. And that's what I feel like sometimes. Like I say to somebody, you own an heirloom. But it's not an heirloom. It's something so valuable. It's a treasure. Let me show you what it is. I like to think of myself as a tour guide, right? And I'm going to bring you to a place where all, like a museum, and I'm going to show you that these portraits on the wall, the sculptures in the hall have so much to say to you. And just open that up. And that's what I think we rabbis ought to be doing. And that's the great gift. Because when you do that, when you open it up, people say, "Oh, that was there. Oh my God." Because the guy who wrote that prayer, the guy who wrote that law, the woman who they experience the same things we experience. How do I live in the world? How do I live in the world with all of its fragility and all of its tragedy and not give up? How do I live in the world when I'm lonely and I need community? How do I live in the world when I'm lost and I need a sense of my map so I know where my purpose is? Our ancestors asked the same questions. They didn't have computers. They didn't have online sources, but they had the same human experiences. And here is a tradition that answers those questions with such beauty and poetry. That's our job.
I love it. I want to move on then actually to a couple of current events. I'm curious now, as we're coming out of COVID, and your synagogue, actually, Beth Shalom, always has had a large online component, from your Torah class being broadcast on Facebook on Saturday mornings and other lectures and things virtually. But for a lot of synagogues, including ours, it's a whole new world. And we're struggling with the question of afterwards, what do we do? How do we make that balance between in-person and virtual? And I'm curious how you guys are navigating that conversation in your community.
We're working on it very hard. It's a wonderful question. There's no substitute for in-person community. So as soon as we can get back, so we're now back for some Shabbos services, we're back for evening minyan, we're back for many things, although people are still reticent to come back, and that's a problem. But we've also discovered that this is a new tool. I like to think that what COVID did was push us forward 10 years in the development of our tools. We would not have gotten to this point for 10 more years. But now that we've gotten to the point, what COVID has taught us is how to use a new set of tools. So I now have a congregation far away, geographically far away from where I sit, but very close to me in terms of our common desire to learn, our common desire to explore, our common desire to understand. So I we are going to try to continue both. We're going to go back and rebuild a very robust in-person experience, and we're going to maintain an online experience. So this coming high holiday, what we have budgeted for and what we are working on is in some ways a double service. We're going to do everything we did last year and everything we did the year before. We're going to have a full retinue of in-person services and a full program of online services. The first for people who will come and be with us, and the second for people who are far away and want to join. Right? And I got to tell you something, Rabbi. My father's 93 and he lives in a rest home up here, not too far from me. He loves coming to shul, but he hasn't been able to come to shul for a year. But Shabbos morning, he has a smart television. I thought that was an oxymoron, but it turns out it's not. And he can watch my Torah study on TV, and he watches me. And as soon as Shabbos is over, he calls me and tells me all the mistakes that I made, and we have an argument about what the Kriya means. So there's a huge community of people like that. So we are going to, now I understand there's halachic issues, do you broadcast on Shabbos? Do you broadcast on Yom Tov? I am willing to sacrifice that halachic problem. That is, I'm willing to be over on broadcasting on Shabbos so that my 93-year-old father can be in Shul Yom Tov and be part of my service, sitting in his room in his rest home, wearing his talis, sharing the service, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others like him. So I think that we have now learned some things about how we do this stuff, and we're going to now push this forward. Online Judaism is now a real thing. It's a real thing. And I think that we're going to see many things that change radically. One of the things that we can see already is that universities are going to change, right? Every university doesn't need to hire a Psych 1 professor. You get the best Psych 1 professor in the country and let him give the class for every undergrad, every freshman, every college freshman in the country, and then have a discussion section in person, right? So you're going to see university education shift online in a very real way, right? You're going to see other kinds of functions shift online. We're going to do meetings online from now on. Because you know what, I don't know about you, but I'm not the biggest fan of board meetings. But it's not so bad if I can do it from my living room and don't have to actually get dressed and go down to the shul and sit through it. And I can do it from my living room and participate in a conversation. There's no substitute for in-person. There's no substitute for an in-person shiva minyan. There's no substitute for an in-person baby naming or wedding or bar mitzvah. There's no substitute for an in-person counseling between two people. But there's lots of things we can do online that we could never do before. And now we're learning how to do them. So yes, this is now part of our Judaism.
I mean, it's one of the great things that we can have you join us for this conversation because we're doing this virtually as opposed to having to fly you out and do a whole weekend and everything.
Although I wouldn't mind flying out and doing a whole
weekend. Just have you for a quick input, but I would absolutely love to have you out for a weekend. I really would.
I love your city, so I would love to be there. I'd love to be there.
It's a great city. The weather I haven't adjusted to in 4 years, but Toronto is a beautiful, beautiful city.
Toronto is a beautiful city with a beautiful Jewish community. And like most Americans of my ilk, I'm desperately jealous of Canada, right? For so many reasons. So we'll spend it one weekend. We'll have a Shabbos and we'll do that. Okay.
It relates to one of the other current events because here in Canada, what I've learned is that we're a little bit a generation behind, I think, the Jewish community. Yeah. At least the conservative Jewish community, at least especially on the West Coast in Los Angeles, where I grew up. And when it comes to conversations about Israel, when I first got here, there was something going on in Israel. I can't remember what it was over the summer, my first couple of weeks as preparing a sermon. And I called up the other rabbi to ask him while he was on his vacation and what he thought about this idea. And he said, of course you can say that from the Bima. Why are you bothering me? But I know that in some communities in LA that being 100% Zionist and supportive, that can be seen even as controversial in some places. There are people you might anger. But what we're seeing now is that even here in Toronto, we have a ordained conservative rabbi who puts on Palestinian liberation seders and other things. And we're watching very, very nervously what's going on in the States with the recent letter signed by dozens of rabbinical students from different schools, including both Ziegler and the Jewish Theological Seminary. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that are and where Zionism and its role in conservative Judaism are. What's the relationship between the two and where do we go from here?
should spend a weekend on this, Rabbi. It's worthy of a whole conversation and historical background. Look, the temper of the times here in the States is polarization. The last 4 years have been, and before that, I mean, we got that way because of our polarization. But this moment in our history has been viciously polarized. We are viciously polarized politically. We are viciously polarized culturally. We are viciously polarized in every way in the general life of our community. The columnist George Will gave a lecture to a group of people that I was part of, and he said to us, how many of you drive a Ford F-150 pickup truck? And of course, this was a cosmopolitan audience drinking white wine, and not one hand went up. He said, how many of you drink Coors Light beer? Not one hand went up. And how many of you have ever attended a NASCAR race? Not one hand up. How many of you have music from country western artists, Garth Brooks, on your radio, on your car radio? Not a hand went up. He said, the Ford F-150 pickup truck is the best-selling vehicle in the world. Not just America, but in the world. But it's been the best-selling vehicle in the United States for the last 20 years, right? Coors Light is the best-selling beer, the best-selling beverage in America. Country western music. NASCAR is the most popular sport, and you people don't. We are a divided culture. We're a divided culture. And politically, we are viciously divided. I don't know if you've been watching the news from the States, but it's gotten literally violent. The Jewish community has absorbed that. Part of it was because of the politics, the Jewish community was pushed into that, but part of it is we've absorbed that polarization. And the polarization is just awful. Just awful. Because you have on the one side vicious Zionism and vicious anti-Zionism. I mean, the pro-radical Zionist, which says any deviation from what is from any criticism of Israel, any deviation from 100% loyalty to everything Israel is and does is anti-Semitism, is disloyalty to the basic project of the Jewish people, and basic anti-Zionism, which has become just vicious, which is, pro-Palestinian, but the worst pro-Palestinian stuff in terms of Israel as an apartheid, racist, imperialist, colonial state that never should have been created. And from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And you hear this in the Jewish community. What's really ironic, and you know this, in Israel, it isn't like that. I mean, if you look at the list that Lapid and Bennett are putting together for their government, Bennett, who is a very right-wing guy, ran in a party called Yamima, which means off to the right, Yamina, and Meretz, which is a very left-wing political movement. They're going to share the cabinet. They're going to share the government. That is, the political spectrum in Israel is much more nuanced, much wider, and there's much more room for argument in Israel. Read Haaretz newspaper. Right? If I took a columnist from Haaretz, erased the name Haaretz, you'd think it was some, and presented it in any American synagogue, you'd think that it was some anti-Zionist, but it's not. It's Haaretz. It's the leading intellectual Jewish newspaper in Israel, the Hebrew newspaper in Israel. So this is a terrible thing that's happened to us. And it's a terrible thing. Now the rabbinical students I have such difficulties with, but here's the answer. Don't just castigate them. Don't point to them and call them foolish, silly anti-Semites. You have to persuade them. We have to go back into our educator mode and teach our children why Jewish peoplehood matters. Because it's on the basis of a sense of Jewish peoplehood and the common history of the Jewish people and the common destiny of the Jewish people that we're going to convince our children to be Zionists, why the state of Israel is such a miracle in the course of Jewish history and why it's so important to our expression of of Jewish peoplehood. I don't think you can teach Zionism without teaching Jewish peoplehood, and I think we've forgotten Jewish peoplehood. And I think that's such an important part of Jewish education that seems to have gotten away from us. And that's what we have to do. So I'm not one of those who's going to tell those rabbinical students, that they're banished, that they're exiled. I would love to talk to them. Right? I would love to have dialogue with them. I would love to remind them of the things that they forgot. There's a beautiful response, by the way, by our teacher, Rabbi Bradley Artson, where he says to them, what about Avat Israel? What about your own people's anguish? right? I've been in Israel when missiles were falling. It's no fun. I was there when a few dozen missiles were falling from Hezbollah and from. It is a frightening thing to look up and see something coming at you at Mach 1 and realize that it's a frightening thing. 4,000 missiles were fired at Israeli neighborhoods. Come on. Now, we need to negotiate. We need to talk. But most of all, we need to persuade them and persuade our children to understand Jewish peoplehood as a deep, deep, abiding value. And on the basis of that, why Zionism is so very important. Now, the conservative movement in Zionism is a whole nother conversation. But right now, it's not the conservative movement, Rabbi. It's the next generation. It's my kids' generation who have a very different experience. I watched it. I was a kid during the Six-Day War. I watched it. I went to Israel during the Yom Kippur War. I happened to be there as a student and worked in Israel that year and went to school. I mean, I've experienced these. My kids don't know this. My kids only know a powerful, invulnerable Israel. I have to go back and reteach Jewish peoplehood.
I mean, I love the idea that it's something we can teach, because it really does concern me. It's not the empathy for the Palestinian side of the story. I think that's great, but it's, as Rabbi Artson said in his piece, the lack of empathy for the Jewish side and the lack of understanding. And I've gotten some complaints when I've said it from the Bima a couple of times, but I really do fear the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that we see in some of the left-wing circles more than the right, not because on the right isn't dangerous, but the person with the AR-15 and the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt looks like a crazy right-wing nut job who hates Jews. But when it's the professor at the university who subtly puts things in and gets to train the next generation of students, the conversations that take place in the New York Times or on CNN, and God forbid in our synagogues is what really scares me. If we don't get to have those conversations and help, as you said, convince or educate and talk, that's what really scares me, is what happens not with your kids' generation, which is my generation, I believe, but the generation after us, when that generation is in the leadership of Jewish institutions. If we haven't done something, I don't know what's left. If it now is maybe kind of when the clock is ticking and we have that final opportunity. But it sounds like you're optimistic that we can do that. We can.
Well, I'm an educator, so by nature I'm optimistic. But more than that, Rabbi, look, we got complacent. We came to believe that liberal democracy was winning everywhere in the world, and that liberal democracy would always protect us as Jews. We got complacent. And it turns out neither one of those propositions is completely true. Number one, liberal democracy must be constantly defended. Liberal democracy must be constantly nurtured, not just in the world, although that's very important, but here at home as well, which means that in a congregation, we need to have the opportunity to hear voices left and right. We need to have voices which aren't critical of Israel and critical of Canadian government, of American government, as well as patriotic voices that are less critical, let's say, or more supportive of the current government. We need to hear many voices. And the idea that I put up a voice which is different than the one you believe in doesn't mean that I don't like you or that you don't have a place in my shul. It means I want you to hear something that you disagree. There's a name for hearing something that's different than what you already believe. It's called education, because it will make you think twice about what you believe, and it will either strengthen your beliefs or modify your beliefs. That's liberal democracy, and we have to fight for it at every opportunity. That's number one. Number two, we have to recognize that even within a liberal democracy, the position of Jews is always going to be slightly precarious, because there are always going to be those on the extremes who find us problematic. It's one of the very few things the extreme right and the extreme left agree on, is that we don't belong here. And we always have to be vigilant about that. And it's not just left, it's left and right. It's the extremes of the left and right. And we have to be very, very careful and very vigilant. The only difference, though, and the reason why I really reject all of these people who are saying it's 1937, 1938 all over again, is because I hear allies. The local police chief in my neighborhood calls me the morning after those terrible incidents in Los Angeles. He says, "Are you okay?" I say, "I'm fine." He says, "Is your congregation okay? Is there anything we can do for you?" The guy's the police chief, Los Angeles Police Department, right? We have We have government on our side. We have police on our side. We have people who understand that if the Jewish community is threatened, then everybody is threatened, then everything we hold dear is threatened, and are willing to fight, and mean strongly fight. I met the local FBI, with Federal Bureau of Investigation, our federal police, guy in charge of terrorism, African-American gentleman, sits in a program with me and he says, I've done this now for 40 years, right? I've devoted my life to protecting everyone who lives in our community, the Sikh community, the Asian community, the Muslim community, and of course the Jewish community. Everyone needs to be protected. That's my job as an American civil servant. So I think that the wonderful thing is to hear those voices within government, and those voices in power, and those voices in culture that are standing with us. And I think that's very powerful.
That's great. It's definitely reason for optimism. And I love what you said about hearing something you disagree with. I mean, that's Jewish. That's the Talmud. That's discussion and rabbinic disagreement and argument, and it helps us to refine what we think. I've joked that before, that I think one of the best things the Catholic Church ever developed was the devil's advocate. They had an official position when they were arguing for sainthood. Somebody was appointed to argue against. It was an official position of the church, so that both sides were present and discussed.
Isn't that beautiful?
I want to be respectful of your time. Is it okay to ask one more question before we do our final teaching? And
sure.
Okay. I'm just, again, talking about the division in the political realm. I know a couple of years ago, when my sister graduated in Iowa, my then girlfriend, now wife, and we made a road trip to Iowa, and we happened to drive through most of the southern states that were at the time voting on abortion bans, and saw all the billboards and everything else. And I remember when, in the next couple of months, when I would see sermons my colleagues were putting online, so many of them were about Judaism says this about abortion, and that's why this is wrong, and Judaism says this. But at the same time, forgetting right or wrong on abortion, it struck me with a sense of difficulty that because Judaism says abortion is okay, we think our local governments should say that it's okay, because we're the minority. If we ever allow it to be decided by our religious beliefs, what's right or wrong politically, and for government to enact, the Jewish belief is never going to be, in a democratic state, the one that wins. So it's a long way of me asking, what do you think is the role of Judaism and politics and public discourse? We could do it currently with talking about morality and ethics of the vaccine and triage, and who gets it first, and what are the rules for the unvaccinated coming back and integrating society. Should religious ethics have any part of that discussion?
That's a wonderful question. Again, worthy of a weekend. I can point you to books that take up that question. Look, on the one side, you'd like to say there's a firm wall between church and state, except that people gain their values in church. And when you look at certain political movements that you and I resonate to, for example, the great civil rights movement of the 1960s, it was led by Martin Luther King, who was the Reverend Martin Luther King. His Christian faith was very important. And then he was succeeded, of course, by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. So his Christian faith was very important to the structuring of that movement. So look, it's very difficult to put a firm wall between these things, because we're not talking about beliefs. There's no legislation that says you got to daven 3 times a day. But it's a question of where you gain your values from. And more than that, to me, religion is a map. It's a map that I hold in my head that tells me how my world is laid out, and what is my path through this world, and what I'm expected to do in the world. And I imagine that I think everybody has that map, but many of us gain our maps from our faith. And our map tells us what's expected of me. And so when I come across social issues of a certain kind, my map tells me who I am at that moment and what's expected of me and where I'm to go, right? And you know, and you have to, I respect the, you have to respect that kind of value. But the question is now, how do you do that in a democratic society when we have different values? And how do you protect the values of minorities against the values of majority? When a majority has a certain view, but the minority is being oppressed by that. And how do you make certain kind of value judgments that are impossible to make empirically, like when life begins? I mean, I'll play prophet with you for a minute and tell you what I think is going to happen. I think that over the next generation, and maybe just the next decade, frankly, the abortion debate is going to wane here in America, because there'll be medical abortions available more and more, and better contraception. And right now, most 90% of abortions are first trimester, in fact, first 6, 8 weeks of 12 weeks of pregnancy. I think that what's going to happen over time is that the bigger issue is going to move from the beginning of life to the end of life. And we're going to end up with a situation where the exact same rhetoric of pro-life, pro-choice is going to be applied to the end of life. What happens when a doctor can replace every one of your organ systems with an artificial heart, liver, kidney, but can't replace your brain? And at what point does a person have a right to say, I've lived long enough and I've had enough, I want to stop living? And at what point can a family say that about a loved one who is deep in dementia or Alzheimer's? And I think that we're going to end up with the exact same viciously vociferous debate over when does life end, and when is it allowed to say, I'm going to take steps to make life end. And that's going to be the next big debate in medical ethics in America. And there too, the Jewish tradition will have what to say about it. But it's going to be an agonizing set of debates. Look, you and I have been with families in the hospital room when the doctor said, I think it's time to turn off the machine. And we know how agonizing that is. Well, that's what's coming. I mean, that's going to be the common experience now as medicine continues to develop in the direction it's going. So, it's a very, very interesting question.
It's one of the questions, actually, just the end of life, that's difficult because conservative Judaism, so much of it is centered in the United States, where euthanasia is not legalized at the moment widely, versus here in Canada, where it is actually. This is on our topics of discussions for Rabbi Elliot Dorff coming up in a couple of weeks. So everyone should stay tuned for that. So I just
Please
wanted to
do.
plug
He's
that in.
A wonderful, wonderful, wonderful
But it's
soul.
a very important topic because it's something that we're facing here in our Jewish communities. But I don't think the majority of conservative rabbis or rabbis in the States are having to face it in the same way when it comes to issues of euthanasia.
It's coming.
But I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Feinstein, for being with us. I want to plug, besides being an educator, and you've actually been a director of a Jewish summer camp, a day school, and been in a pulpit position now for many, many years. But you're also a very accomplished author. These are just a few of the books. I highly recommend to anybody who would like more about learning about American Judaism. Really, it's Canadian Judaism too. It's about Judaism in the New World. What do we do? Judaism came from Europe to North America. This is a phenomenal introduction to that, as well as the life and teachings of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who really, if there was any rabbi in history I could ever have met, it's between him and Baruch Spinoza. The two are my rabbis that I've never had the pleasure of getting to learn with personally. And for parents that ask me of, Rabbi, what can I do with my kids, or grandparents, sorry, I want to add more Judaism to their life. How do I do that? Their parents, I don't think, are doing enough. I tell them, get this book, and this is what you read to them when they come over. Capturing the Moon. It's a collection of Jewish stories put together by Rabbi Feinstein. It's really phenomenal. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And before we send you off, can you just give us your favorite piece of Torah? Just a quick teaching that's important to you, that stayed with you, that's meaningful to you. What would that piece of Torah be that you live by?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me today. And it's wonderful to spend some time in Toronto, and wish all of you and your congregants a quiet and a peaceful summertime of renewal and recreation. I once spent a summer in Camp Ramah in Canada. I used to say it's the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in Bracebridge, Ontario. I sat with my parka at the table, eating my breakfast in the morning, watching my cornflakes freeze in the bowl. So it's a marvelous place to wonderful. Lake Halliburton. It's a wonderful place to spend a summertime. I'm very taken, and I teach this in my congregation frequently, about how this whole project began. A man named Abraham is singled out by God and told, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave home. Leave everything you know behind. Start over again. I want you to recreate yourself. And the task at hand is Heyeh bracha, be a blessing. I know what it means to say a blessing. I know what it means to bless someone. I bless my kids every Friday night. But what does it mean to be a blessing? What does it mean to walk the world and touch other souls in such a way that when someone mentions your name, someone will close their eyes and sigh and say, ah, Rabbi Sacks is my blessing. My blessing. What would you have to do? What would you have to say? That is the ultimate, I think, job description of the Jewish people. Because a few lines later he says, and all the people of the world will be blessed because you're around. God doesn't say what you think he's going to say. God doesn't say be a blessing to me. God says be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That's our job, to be a blessing to all the families of the earth and certainly to be a blessing to each other. And that's what we're called upon to do. So when a kid has a bar mitzvah in my shul, I love to put my arm around him and tell him, you know, kid, I hope you get into Stanford or Yale. And I hope you make it big as you said you wanted to. And I hope you have all of the gifts and accolades and rewards that our culture gives someone who strives hard. But you know what? Success in life is not about material things. It's about whether you live your life as a blessing and whether you collect other people who live life as a blessing. And that's what makes life worth living. And that to me is the most significant line of the Torah.
It's a wonderful teaching. I think the world needs that. It's small acts. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be giant, but just to be a blessing to somebody else.
There's no such thing as small acts. That's the whole point. There's no such thing. And this year, by God, as we've talked about, we've seen it, you know, the nurse who went into the IC room and held the hand of my congregant as he died because his family couldn't be there with him. Right? The doctor who put in the extra 5-6 hours on a shift well beyond his closing time because he had the drugs and he had the know-how to heal and to help. The scientist, the mom and dad who stayed home with kids, didn't kill them, you know, while they did Zoom school and protected them. The teacher who came back to work even though nobody else was vaccinated in the school because kids need to be in school. The grocery worker, every one of these heroes, there is no such thing as small acts in the world of spirit. Big and small are categories of things. There is no such thing as small acts in the world of spirit. Every act in the world of spirit is an act of monumental heroism. And for heroes in the world, you have my blessings.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. It's so wonderful to have you start off this season of Learning with My Rabbis, because not only were you a teacher of mine, you continue to be, and I continue to learn from you. And
thanks, Rabbi.
It's such a pleasure to have you with us. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And again, Rabbi Feinstein, thank you so much for being with us to share your Torah. We hope everyone will come back next week for another episode. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Oh, you don't love God.
If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets in